In this video, you will learn how to find distinct elements of an array. An array may contain some elements that are duplicates. Sometimes you must display each value only once by removing the duplicates. You can remove duplicate values with the distinct algorithm. I will demonstrate the distinct algorithm with this project that you can program with me. If you are new to array and array algorithms in Delphi, first go watch lesson 17.1 to 17.9 to get a better understanding. With the button on the left, you must retrieve the names of countries that won the Rugby World Cup since its inception in 1987. The Rugby World Cup happens every 4 years, so 9 World Cup tournaments were played since 1987. This list box displays the 9 country names that won those tournaments. If you look closer, you will see that some countries like South Africa, New Zealand and Australia appear more than once. We must remove the duplicate names and only display the winning country's name once in the second list box. So in the 9 times the World Cup was played, only 4 countries won it so far. Hi, it's Gerard here from LearnDelphi. I'm a trainer in programming languages, and in this series I help you to understand Delphi programming step by step and line by line. If this video is helpful to you, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And I also publish all the links I mention in this video in the description box below. In all our lessons I start with the code immediately. I do not demonstrate how to create the graphical user interface. That is so that you only focus on the code of the lesson we are doing. If you want to follow what I'm doing but you want to save some time, you can download the starter project to start immediately where I start with this lesson. The starter and solution project files are available for download from my Patreon page at patreon.com/learndelphi. I also posted that link in the description. And I'm using Delphi Community Edition to demonstrate these lessons. There's also a link in the description if you want to download the free copy of Delphi. You can pause the video here and go do the downloads. I will go ahead and explain the distinct algorithm while you wait for the downloads to finish. In this explanation, I will only demonstrate distinction with the countries that won the first 6 World Cup tournaments. To pick out unique names from the main array, you must perform a series of comparisons from top to bottom with 2 loops. An outer loop will anchor the first name that must be used in the comparison, while an inner loop cycles the tail end or the rest of the array to search for duplicates. If a unique or distinct value is found, it will be added to another array. This will continue until all the duplicate country names are eliminated and distinct names are picked out. New Zealand won the World Cup in the first tournament in 1987. Australia won 4 years later in 1991. South Africa won in 1995. Then Australia won it again in 1999. In 2003, England took it for the first time. And in 2007, it was won by South Africa again. For this explanation, we store this list of winners in an array called ARR, all winners. The array has 6 elements, indexed from 1 to 6. You must now loop through the array and find each distinct country name, even if they are stored more than once in the array. The distinct names must then be stored in a second array. You may declare a fixed size array, but then you must provide enough empty elements in advance to contain all the possible matches. Ideally, a fixed size array will contain the same number of elements, because all the values may be unique. But a better way is to use a dynamic array because it is more efficient. It doesn't use unnecessary space in memory, because it only adds new elements just in time when it is needed. And we will also not run into problems where the array becomes too small for all the possible duplicate names. While your code loops through the main array, the algorithm must keep track of a few values. You must have an integer to store the size of the main array. A second integer variable will be used to set the size of the dynamic array every time a distinct name is found. One of our loops will find the first name that we want to compare. To track the cycles, we must have another integer variable that will serve as the counter for a for loop. A second loop must find the next name we want to compare in the array. This integer variable will be used by a while loop to keep track of the next index. You will also use a Boolean variable as a flag when a duplicate name is found. There are 4 rules we must program in the algorithm to make it efficient. Rule 1. When the inner loop cycles through the whole array, it must exit to allow the outer loop to find another name. Rule 2. The inner loop must exit as soon as a duplicate name is found. That will prevent the algorithm from doing unnecessary cycles. Rule 3. The outer loop must only cycle up to the second last element, because there is nothing to compare after the last element. And Rule 4. The last element will always be added to the dynamic array. If the last index is a duplicate, like South Africa in this example, the first occurrence will be ignored. So the last occurrence of the name will always be used if the name is in the array more than once. You will see what I mean when I walk through the algorithm. You must first get the length or the size of the array and store it in an integer variable. This array has 6 elements. Then you initialize the variable that sets the size of the dynamic array. The dynamic array will have 0 elements at the start. Then you enter the outer loop. This is a for loop that starts at 1, and its upper bound is the size of the array minus 1. The for loop cycles from index 1 to 5, so it will start with New Zealand. Remember, it must only cycle up to the second last element, because there must always be something after it to compare. Then you get the next index and assign it to another integer variable. This will be the current index from the outer loop plus 1. This integer will track the index of the second value that must be compared. At the start, we assume that there isn't a duplicate, so you set the boolean to false. After that, the compiler enters a while loop. This loop will continue cycling through the array while the next index is less or equal to the size of the array, and while the boolean is false. The size of the array is 6 and the next index is 2. We did set the boolean to false, so both these conditions are true. This is 2 of the 4 rules I mentioned earlier. Inside the while loop, we have an if statement that checks if the name of the current index is equal to the name of the next index. In this example, it compares index 1 with index 2. New Zealand and Australia do not match, so the boolean stays false. Then the compiler checks the else branch, and you increase the next index to 3. Then you enter else branch. The while loop is not at the last index yet, and the boolean is still false, so the compiler must jump back to the top of the while loop. The if statement now compares index 1 with index 3. New Zealand and South Africa do not match, so the else branch increments the next index to 4, and the boolean stays false. We haven't met the condition to exit the while loop yet, so the compiler jumps back to the top of the while loop. The if statement now compares index 1 with index 4. New Zealand and Australia do not match, so the else branch increments the next index to 5 and the boolean stays false. We haven't met the condition to exit the while loop yet, so the compiler jumps back to the top of the while loop. The if statement now compares index 1 with index 5. New Zealand and England do not match, so the else branch increments the next index to 6 and the boolean stays false. We still didn't meet the conditions to exit the while loop. The compiler jumps back to the top of the while loop. The if statement now compares index 1 with index 6. New Zealand and South Africa do not match, so the else branch increments the next index to 7. Now the while loop must exit, because it reached the last element of the array, so it meets this condition. After exiting the loop, another if statement checks if the boolean is false. In this case, it is false. So you first increment the integer that sets the size of the dynamic array to 1. Then you use Delphi's setLength procedure to add the new element to the dynamic array. Notice this element's index is 0 because dynamic arrays are 0 based. Then you assign New Zealand from the current index of the main array to index 0 of the dynamic array. Notice we subtract 1 from the size of the dynamic array to reference an index that is 1 less than the size. That is because the size is 1, but the index is 0. So this will reference index 0 the first time we add an element to the dynamic array. We are done with New Zealand in the main array. During this cycle of the outer loop, we couldn't find a duplicate for New Zealand, so New Zealand is distinct. The for loop still has a lot of work to do. It only compared New Zealand so far, but it must go until it gets to the second last index, which is England in this example. The algorithm doesn't have to compare New Zealand again, so we will only loop through the tail end of the array during future cycles. The compiler jumps back to the outer loop. The current index increments to 2. The next index is set to the current index plus 1, in other words 3. The boolean is set to false. Then the while loop enters again. Then the if statement checks if the name in index 2 matches the name in index 3. Australia and South Africa do not match. The if branch ends, and the else branch increments the next index to 4. The compiler jumps back to the top of the while loop. Then the if statement checks if the name of index 2 matches the name of index 4. Australia is a duplicate. If a duplicate is found, you set the boolean to true. The while loop must exit if the boolean is true. So this condition is met. This means unnecessary cycles and comparisons will be avoided when a duplicate is found, because the rest of the tail end of the array will be ignored. After exiting the while loop, we check if the boolean is false. At the moment it is true, so the if statement ends without resizing and adding Australia into the dynamic array. The outer loop is not done yet, so the compiler jumps back to the top of the for loop. It increments the current index to 3, and that is South Africa. Before I continue, I want you to focus on 2 things here. The outer loop already processed the first 2 elements, so it doesn't have to compare New Zealand and the first occurrence of Australia again. It must only cycle through the tail end or the remaining elements. Secondly, if a country's name occurs more than once, like Australia in this example, the first occurrence will not be added to the dynamic array. Later, when the outer loop gets to the second occurrence of Australia, in the tail end of the array, it will be added to the dynamic array. The for loop now moved on to South Africa in index 3. Then you set the next index to 4. Then the boolean is set to false. You enter the while loop again. Then the if statement checks if the value in index 3 matches the value in index 4. South Africa and Australia do not match. The if branch ends and you enter the else branch. You increment the next index to 5. The conditions of the while loop are not met, so the compiler jumps back to the top of the while loop. Then the if statement checks if the name in the current index matches the name in the next index. South Africa and England do not match. The if branch ends and you enter the else branch. You increment the next index to 6. The conditions in the while loop are still not met, so the compiler jumps back to the top of the while loop. Then the if statement checks if the name in the current index matches the name in the next index. South Africa is a duplicate. The boolean is set to true. Now this condition of the while loop is met, so the while loop exits. After exiting the while loop, another if statement checks if the boolean is false. The boolean is true. If the boolean is true, the if statement ends, without adding a new index in the dynamic array. So the first occurrence of South Africa is also ignored. We will catch the second occurrence later when the outer loop gets to the tail end of the array. The outer loop is not at the second last index yet, so the compiler jumps back to the top of the for loop. The current index increments to 4, and the second occurrence of Australia will now be used. Notice how the tail of the array is getting shorter. Also notice that the last 3 elements in the tail end is all unique. So now you will see how they will all be added to the dynamic array. Then the next index is set to 5. The boolean is set back to false, and we enter the while loop again. Then the if statement checks if the name in index 4 matches the name in index 5. Australia and England do not match. The if branch ends and you enter the else branch again. The next index increments to 6. You didn't meet the conditions to exit the while loop yet, so the compiler jumps back to the top of the while loop. Then the if statement checks if the name in index 4 matches the name in index 6. Australia and South Africa do not match. The if statement ends, and you enter the else branch again. The next index increments to 7. The next index is greater than the size of the array, so you met this condition to exit the while loop. Now another if statement checks if the boolean is false. It is false, so you increment the integer that sizes the dynamic array to 2. Then you use the setLength procedure to add the second index into the dynamic array. Then you assign the second occurrence of Australia from the main array to the new element. The for loop still has one more cycle to go to process the second last index. The compiler jumps back to the top of the for loop, and the current index increments to 5. This will be the second last index. Then the next index is set to 6. The boolean is set to false. Then we enter the while loop again. The if statement checks if the name in index 5 matches the name in index 6. England and South Africa do not match. The if branch ends and you enter the else branch again. The next index increments to 7. The next index is greater than the size of the array, so you met this condition to exit the while loop. Now another if statement checks if the boolean is false. It is false, so you increment the integer that sizes the dynamic array to 3. Then you use the setLength procedure to add the third index to the dynamic array. Then you assign England from the main array to the new element. The if statement ends, and the outer loop reaches the second last element, so it also ends. Remember, rule 4 dictates that you must always add the last element in the main array to the dynamic array. This makes sense because we didn't add the first occurrence of South Africa earlier in the process. After exiting the outer loop, we increment the integer that sizes the dynamic array to 4. Then we use the setLength procedure to add the new element to the array. Finally, we also assign the last element from the main array to the new element of the dynamic array. That is the end of the algorithm. You now picked out a single occurrence of each country in the main array and add it to the dynamic array. You may need to go through this explanation a few more times. Pause the video at each step and compare the code on the left with the pictures on the right to make sure you understand the whole process. Now let's do this in a project. Here I have my project open in Delphi. If your download's finished, open the Starter project in Delphi and follow what I'm doing. Double-click the button on the left side of the form. Scroll up until you can see the implementation clause. Here I already declared a string array with 9 elements. The array contains 9 country names that won the Rugby World Cup since 1987. Notice that New Zealand won it 3 times, Australia won it twice, South Africa also won it 3 times, and England won it once. Remember, we must only get the last occurrence of each country name. But let's first show all these elements in a list box. Go back to the button's click event handler. Go above begin. Type var. Enter and type str country name as string. This string must store each individual winner as we loop through the array. Go between begin and end. Type lst all winners dot clear. We clear this list box. Make a new line. Type for str country name in ARR all winners do. Press enter and type begin. Press enter. Now type this statement. We use a for in loop to find each individual country name in the array. Then we take the country name and add it to the list box named LST all winners. Run the program. Click the button on the left. The list box displays the names of the countries as they are stored in the array. Notice all these duplicate names. Now let's remove the duplicates and display only distinct country names. Close the form. Click the Design tab. Double-click the button on the right. Go above the begin statement. Type var. Enter and type ARR distinct winners as array of string. We declare a dynamic array that must store the distinct country names. Enter again. Type int current index, comma, int next index, comma, int all winner size, comma, int distinct winner size as integer. These two integers track the indexes of the two names that must be compared by the two loops. Int all winner size stores the size of the main array, and int distinct winner size will be used to size the dynamic array. Enter. Type bln duplicate found as boolean. This boolean will indicate if a duplicate name is found. Enter again. Type str distinct country name as string. This string variable stores each individual distinct country name as we loop through the dynamic array. Go between begin and end. Type this statement. Here we get the element count of the array with the length function, and we assign it to the integer named int winner size. Enter and type int distinct winner size, colon equals 0. We set the initial value of the variable that sizes the dynamic array to 0. Enter and type lst distinct winners dot clear. We clear this list box. Make a new line. Type this comment. Enter. Type for int current index, colon equals 1, 2, int all winner size, minus 1, do. Enter and type begin. Enter again. This for loop is the outer loop that gets the first name that must be used in the comparison. It starts at 1 and its upper bound is the size of the array minus 1. In other words, up to the second last element of the main array. Now type int next index, colon equals int current index plus 1. We add 1 to the current index and assign it to int next index. Enter. Type bln duplicate found, colon equals false. We assume that there are no duplicates, so we make the boolean false. Make a new line, type this comment. Enter, type this while loop. Enter and type begin. Enter again. This is the while loop that finds the second name that must be compared. It must loop while the next index is less or equal to the size of the main array and while the boolean is false. Type this comment. Press enter. Now type this if statement. Enter and type begin. Enter again. This if statement checks if the name of the current index matches the name of the next index. Type BLN duplicate found, colon equals true. If the two names match, you set the boolean to true. We will have an else branch, so remove the semicolon after this end. Press enter, type else, press enter and type begin. Press enter again, type this statement. If the two names do not match, you increment the next index. Now let's give descriptions for all these end statements. This one ends the else. This one ends the while loop. And this one ends the for loop. And this one ends the procedure. The last one with the full stop ends the unit. Make a new line under the end of the while loop. Type this comment. Press enter. Type if BLN duplicate found equals false. Then enter and type begin. Press enter again. Type this statement. If the boolean is still false after the while loop ends, you increment the variable that sizes the dynamic array. Press enter, type this statement. Here we use the setLength procedure to add a new index to the dynamic array. Now enter and type this statement. Here we read the country name in the current index of the main array and assign it to the new index we just added to the dynamic array. Notice we subtract 1 from the size because the dynamic array index starts at 0. This line ends the if statement. Make a new line after the end of the for loop. Type this comment. Enter. Now type this statement. After the for loop processes the second last element and ends, you must always add the name in the last index of the main array to the dynamic array. So here we increment the integer that resizes the dynamic array. Enter and type this statement. Here we add the new element to the dynamic array again. Enter again and type this statement. Here we assign the last index from the main array to the new index we just added to the dynamic array. These three statements look similar to the three statements here in the if statement, but they are not. Here we add the current index found by the outer loop to the dynamic array. But here we add the last index of the main array to the dynamic array. This is the whole algorithm to find the distinct values in an array. You can also do this with arrays of other data types like numbers and dates. Now let's display the output. Make a new line. Type this comment. Press enter. Type 4. str distinct country name. In ARR distinct winners. Do. Press enter and type begin. Enter again. Type this statement. We use a for in loop to find each individual distinct country name in the dynamic array. Then we take the country name and add it to the items of the list box. Now run the project. Click the button on the left. Now click the distinct button. The list box must display 4 unique country names, so we remove the duplicates. Close the form and save your project. Next time we will learn how to union or merge 2 or more arrays. If you enjoyed this lesson, please leave a comment. And if you learned something new, please like, subscribe and share my lessons with your friends. Thank you for watching, and a special thank you to my supporters on patreon.com. And happy coding! See you next time.